I'm probably kicking a hornet's nest with this, but I'm gonna try and do it anyway. Denji is the 16-year-old protagonist of the story. He forms a contract with his friend Pochita to become the titular Chainsaw Man, who works for the public safety devil hunters. He's highly controversial because it's quite easy to take his ignorance and inexperience in life as apathy towards his environment and the consequences of his actions. Many people reduce him down to nothing but a horny and selfish teenager because of his shallow motivations and juvenile dreams. But he is a kid, and I hate to say it, but most of the people his age would be considered imperfect and ignorant people. And I feel like that's an idea that a lot of people have trouble getting past with a fictional protagonist. I mean, he's flawed by our own personal standards, but he has room to grow. Both things are true. However, being annoyed at his ignorance is kind of silly when the story spends a lot of time developing him into a more empathetic and self-aware person, instead of just playing it all off as a joke. The theme of ignorance is one of the largest overarching themes of the story, and it begins with how Denji learns to navigate life and interactions with other people. He begins his life learning that life is relatively give and take, and a lot of interactions you'll have with other people are transactional in nature. He doesn't become an emotionless monster or anything like that. If anything, he demonstrates a lot of emotional intelligence, even if he has a bit of trouble articulating his thoughts and feelings a lot of the time. Denji is a good kid, so let's focus on how the dynamics in his life make it difficult for him to become more critical of his thoughts and ideas, but don't really prevent him from being kind and empathetic to the people around him. To understand our protagonist, let's say it straight. Denji is a deeply traumatized child. He has no role models, basically raised himself, and the only adults he knows are extorting him for a debt he didn't create. His life sucks so much that he's missing an eye, one of his nuts, and numerous organs just because selling them gave him more immediate benefits than keeping them to live longer. I'm not entirely sold on the idea of using trauma as a catch-all defense for why a character or even a person in real life does the things that they do. But acting like he wasn't molded by a lack of parental figures, role models, and even interaction with people that are around the same age as him is plain ignorant of how he's written. Transactional relationships pervade every part of Chainsaw Man. Contracts made with devils come at great cost to the people seeking power, and Denji trades his safety and well-being for food in his belly and a roof over his head. The story begins with Denji being exploited by the Yakuza who forced him to be their child laborer to repay a debt he inherited from his late father. He makes pretty much no money after the work he does, and lives in a shack in the middle of nowhere. Denji's only friend is Pochita, who is a devil as well as his trusty chainsaw. When the Yakuza are bitten by the zombie devil and kill Denji, he remembers a time when he said he'd leave his body behind for Pochita in order to let him live a fulfilling life for the both of them. Instead, Pochita offers to be Denji's heart because he loved hearing Denji talk about his dreams, granting him the powers of the Chainsaw Devil in exchange for Denji living a normal life. This scene demonstrates one of the few times in the entirety of Chainsaw Man that Denji is offered something that barely costs him anything, effectively allowing him to live freely without constraints. Which would be heartwarming and emotional if it weren't for the fact that immediately after this, Denji falls into Makima's hands who asks him to be her dog, a devil hunter at public safety. It's a coercive offer because if he refuses, he will be executed by the state due to the threat posed by his devil powers. But if he agrees, he will constantly be surrounded by death and conflict. The terms of Makima's job offer allows Denji to live, but places him under very strict constraints such as limited freedom of movement and constant surveillance. The freedom that Pochita afforded Denji is immediately caged by the walls that Makima places around him, but he doesn't understand what's wrong with the arrangement. She's kind to him, which is an improvement over the Yakuza, but Denji is now a dog that can only say yes or woof. Any refusal to follow her orders is met with a swift execution. The trade-off is not that bad in Denji's mind because it's materially better than being a child slave to the Yakuza. Marginal increases in benefits are more desirable than what he came from, which is basically having nothing, so to him it's a no-brainer that he should take this job. Before we go forward, I want to say that having a stupid dream or being somewhat shallow in your interests doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. I could want nothing but a PlayStation 5 as my only material goal in life, but that wouldn't really prevent me from being kind to people and empathetic to people around me. Your dream is not the same as who you are as a person, which is an idea that Denji consistently shows throughout the series. He's curious about things like sex, relationships, popularity, and comfort, but still good to his family and friends. Surprise, surprise, socially inexperienced Denji is curious about things like sex while going through puberty. Water is also wet. It's a pretty ridiculous reason to dislike him in my eyes, especially since he didn't have a lick of freedom and hasn't had a childhood until this point. Of course his goals will be less grandiose than I want to save the world or solve world hunger or something. Denji is ignorant of coercion because he doesn't understand what making an informed decision is. He never asked to repay his father's debt, and nothing he did brought it about. He just assumes that most transactions have some fucked up terms. So being killed at your job is no different from what he was doing before in his mind. He just gets paid better now. Makima is the first human that's ever been kind to Denji, and she's not actually kind and empathetic towards his plight. She's just pushing every button in his brain so he'll never turn against her. She knows exactly what he wants to hear, so she says it. She doesn't use her powers on him because he's just a vulnerable kid who's curious about a lot, including women, sex, and relationships. All she wants from Denji is the Chainsaw Devil, and to that end, she indulges his fantasy and inexperience so that she can nullify the contract he has with the Chainsaw Devil later. In their first meeting, Aki Hayakawa is less impressed than most. He meets Denji and listens to him talk for a bit, then beats the shit out of him for being too lax and nonchalant about a job that is about protecting and saving the public from devils. Denji doesn't consider that his co-workers will often die in the line of duty, and that hesitation and a lack of vigilance may cost people their lives. Aki's entire family was killed by devils, so he understands the urgency of his job because Aki sees his job as more than just give and take. By contrast, Denji does not fear losing anybody now that his only friend is gone. So he's driven a little bit more by the benefits than saving lives at this point. Initially, Denji sees transactions only in terms of how they affect him. If he can get some positive benefits for himself, he doesn't understand why that isn't always a good thing. It's not that Denji is selfish and apathetic about the relationship of cause and effect, it's that his actions were largely inconsequential for the most part since he spent most of his youth working off a debt he inherited from his father. He's not used to looking out for other people besides himself because that's how he lived 16 years of his life to this point, and he's never really had someone else's life in his hands besides Pochita's. Because of that, his understanding of social dynamics is stunted when it comes to friendships, families, co-workers, and social norms. There's no reason to believe that Denji should be a morally upstanding individual with virtuous goals because he has nobody to teach him about those things. Where would he have learned about kindness, empathy, maturity, and it's even funny to see people describe Denji poorly, because if you had to sit and speak with yourself at like age 14 or 15, I would wager a large majority of people would feel grossed out by their own beliefs and worldviews on some level. Denji is not done growing. Even in the latest chapters of the manga, he's still got flaws, but it's nothing egregious or offensive with regards to the overall narrative. Who he is right now is just a snapshot of his life, not the only thing he'll ever be. Despite the tough lesson that Aki Hayakawa gives to Denji, he spends his time cooking, cleaning, and caring for Denji as his older brother. Very few characters in the story are super affectionate people, but the people that are usually want to capture the Chainsaw Devil. Aki probably sees a part of himself in Denji, at least when it comes to being stubborn and rebellious. Aki doesn't outright say that he loves and cares for Denji, or that he wants the best for him, but the love he has for Denji as his older brother figure is apparent when you read between the lines. He lectures him about keeping a clean living space, having a good diet, and taking care of his hygiene. It might not sound like anything special, but teaching someone you're responsible for to take care of themselves and be independent is just another way of saying that you love them as their family member. It might be incredibly hard to see at times, but when you really think about it, sometimes the most blatant show of love is implied through actions that people take so that your well-being is protected. While Aki is alive, Denji's not out here like, oh, he's just tough on me because he wants the best for me. And he doesn't fully understand that Aki, like Pochita, is one of the few people that don't really ask anything unreasonable of Denji. Which is why Denji struggles to process his pain when Aki is killed later in the story. Aki's role as an older brother figure isn't something that Denji can even appreciate until it's something he no longer has. The nagging and the lecturing, it's something that he didn't know he'd miss once he could no longer hear his voice. Power is introduced as an eccentric, funny, and boastful character that will allow Denji to touch her chest if he helps her save her cat friend. She sets him up to get killed by the Bat Devil, but the deal goes awry and both of them almost die. Denji recalls a time where he thought he'd lost his best friend, and contemplates how Power must have felt knowing that Meowie was being held hostage. Even though Denji takes on this mission because he's sexually curious, he only completes the mission after almost being killed because he empathizes with her struggle for her friend. In the subsequent battle against the Leech Devil, Denji wagers his pride and his dreams and says that if he wins the battle despite having relatively shallow dreams, then his dream is more meaningful than that of the Leech, and by extension, everyone else's. This is hilarious because he immediately gets pummeled and then saved by Aki, telling you outright that even the narrative knows that his dreams are at times kind of vapid, but not necessarily meaningless. Denji grows from the experience not because he learns something in the thick of saving Power's life, or because his desire to touch boobs was met with a near-death experience. but because when he touched Power's boobs, he didn't feel anything different. He didn't feel that much joy or excitement, and even though the viscera of touching some titties was clearly enjoyable to some extent, there was a mismatch between his expectation and the reality of things. This manifests one of Chainsaw Man's major themes, which is ignorance. Ignorance refers to a lack of knowledge or awareness, something that Denji has in droves due to his limited life experiences. His curiosity about things like sexuality, romance, and more complicated emotions like grief drive a lot of his decisions about life. He doesn't view life simply as how it can benefit, but he tends to take on tasks that benefit his curiosity while also helping others get something out of it too. Because Denji's never had friends, never had a romantic partner, and never lived an ounce of a normal life, every transaction presented to him will seem materially beneficial. Which is why it feels like a lot of the time Denji can't really make an informed decision. This is why it's so easy for Makima to ask Denji increasingly unreasonable things, because it lets him grow closer to Makima without even really thinking about how it affects his own well-being. Working for public safety has got to be one of the worst jobs imaginable, and Aki took lengths to spell that out for Denji. But he just can't understand why this chain-smoking adult is nagging him for a job that pays better than hunting devils for the Yakuza. If you're ignorant to the fact that you're being exploited, does that mean you're not being exploited? Any reasonable person would say no, and take lengths to elucidate to people why they're not being treated in a dignified or acceptable manner. Despite having relatively juvenile aspirations, Denji is consistently shown to be very kind and empathetic. He spent every waking moment with Power when she was traumatized by the Darkness Devil, and he missed seeing her happy and carefree like she usually is. When Himeno passed away, he didn't feel anything, but he actively interrogated why he was processing his emotions that way. To act like Denji doesn't care about others and is kind of just emotionless and selfish is stupid. And the funny thing is, that's how Makima sees Denji, which the story consistently contradicts through his interactions with other people. Maybe the reason Denji is okay with very little awareness of complicated ideas, feelings, and the cycle of give and take is because ignorance really is bliss. Let's interrogate that. Ignorance is broad in nature. There are plenty of things in life that we don't know and haven't experienced. There are ideas that we believe simply because we lack the awareness to have a well-rounded and informed perspective. It's a concept that pervades not just Denji's life, but our own. It's a malleable idea to explore because at no point in our lives do we stop learning and growing. We are constantly trying to learn and understand more things at any given point, even if we're not consciously thinking about it as an indefinite cycle of self-development. Who we are one day may fundamentally be different from the person we are a couple of years from now. Himeno was Aki Hayakawa's first partner, and she sacrificed herself so that she could not only protect Aki but help him triumph over Sawatari and the Snake Devil. The immense guilt, grief, and despair that Aki felt were extremely confronting for Denji to see. It's uncomfortable because Denji doesn't really understand grief too well, and he immediately wonders why he isn't upset and ponders why he was sad when Pochita died. He also wonders how he'd feel if Aki or Power died. He thinks that if Makima died, he'd be down for like 3 days before bouncing back to his usual self. So long as his needs are met, he can be happy, which prompts the thought that maybe he lost his human heart when he died. He senses that there's something abnormal about his lack of grief, but to his credit, he didn't really know Himeno that well. But it shows an ability to critically assess how he processes his emotions. He dispels this line of thinking by telling himself that he just needs to forget the serious stuff, and that thinking about unhappy thoughts will just make him unhappy. He comes extremely close to a moment of meaningful self-reflection before shutting away from the thoughts because they're complicated, uncomfortable, and honestly, very human worries to have. Why worry about how you process your emotions and whose lives you would want if they passed if you just stopped thinking about it, right? It's not like you work the most dangerous job in the narrative, where everyone you know may die one by one or something. In this moment, his introspection guided him to something worth knowing, but he stops himself just short of a realization because that's simply easier than doing the work to change himself. It's much easier to resign yourself to the whims of circumstance than actually confront the uncomfortable reality inside your head. This is demonstrated numerous times when Denji becomes overwhelmed when thinking about his life. Aki might be a strict older brother figure to Power and Denji, but he does everything to help them thrive and take care of themselves. He allows himself to be weak and cry because he knows there's no strength in pretending it doesn't affect him, and it would disrespect her memory if he fronted like it wasn't eating him up inside. The disparity between the two is clear. With grief, Aki is willing to face the truth of things and allow himself to process and recover from them, but Denji will turn away from the discomfort that comes with the awareness and self-reflection. He's not incapable of growing, he's just uncomfortable with the grueling process of it because of a deeply buried trauma. I'm sure that young Aki was a stubborn shithead like Kishibe describes to Himeno, meaning that young Aki and Denji are probably relatively similar. So Aki is just trying to help Denji become more self-aware and look at himself more objectively. Aki isn't such a well-rounded and mature person because that's just who he is. It's because he must constantly confront the facts. His co-workers will die, and when it's someone who means a lot to him, it's gonna hurt a lot. Despite the death toll of public safety, Aki doesn't become desensitized to death, but he eventually stopped looking at himself objectively. Because unlike fiends and hybrids, when he dies, his death is relatively permanent. He knew that smoking would be bad for him, but the pain and stress of his job has turned him into a chain smoker, which is one last parting gift that Himeno left him with. It's depressing to think that she actually wanted him to leave public safety and live, and when it came down to it, we learn at the end of his life that he didn't even really like Makima romantically. He lacks a memory of any significant reason he would like her, alluding to the fact that much like the fiends, his memory's been manipulated. Aki's fate is inarguably one of the most harrowing things in Chainsaw Man, spending his entire life pursuing revenge on the Gun Devil, only to become the Gun Fiend because he was just a clueless pawn in Makima's greater plan. Once Aki stops looking at himself objectively, he just wants to get stronger and stronger, knowing full well that he is on the road to certain death. Aki puts aside the fact that the Future Devil is giving him such an overpowered ability for basically nothing because his death is unavoidable. The Future Devil just wants to sit in his right eye because it wants front row seats to watch one man's quest for revenge result in an ironic twist where he becomes the very thing he intends to destroy. A lot of things are ironic in Chainsaw Man because irony is a cruel thing to watch when it comes to the fates that people have. To top it off, Aki wasn't really interested in replacing his younger brother with somebody else. But much like his brother passing before him, he would leave Denji behind because he played in the snow, which makes me feel sick to my stomach because of how bad I feel for him, as well as Denji. For the past 3 years of Aki's life, he has been working tirelessly to assemble pieces of the Gun Devil, only to be told that the governments are just using them like nuclear warheads. If they can summon a fraction of its power to subjugate other nations, they will. Aki wasn't helping the government track down the Gun Devil, he was increasing the military might at their disposal. His entire career was based on a lie by omission. He thought he was chasing the Gun Devil, but he was unknowingly chasing geopolitical power. I don't think that anyone's fates are set in stone in this story. I just think that no matter what Aki chose to do, every single main character was accounted for in Makima's plan, as much as that pains me to say. At least Aki was able to be a good older brother figure to Power and Denji, who really needed a positive role model. Denji's ignorance extends to his sexual inexperience. Touching Power's chest is visceral because he's never done it before, but it didn't give him the surge of emotions that he expected. We know that Denji knows what porno mags are, seeing as he wanted to protect some from the blood splatters earlier in the story, but with no one to teach him a healthy understanding of sex, boundaries, and health, he can't really grasp it other than as a thing that he does to make himself feel good. He doesn't feel all that excited, and seems kind of disappointed because there's a mismatch between his expectations. Makima takes advantage of his ignorance around sex to feed him ideas about intimacy and knowing someone well to make sex feel good. She immediately props herself up as the person it'll feel good to have sex with, to make sure that Denji's cage feels as comfortable as possible despite the obvious coercion in this scene. Even if they were the same age, she's his boss, and if he quits his job, he's gonna be killed by public safety. But she's also offering to fuck him if he kills the Gun Devil? Make it make sense. He can't realistically consent to anything in this scenario for a number of reasons, and he's also unaware of normal and healthy boundaries concerning sex and relationships. Which is why Makima finds it so easy to control Denji through his sexual imagination as opposed to just manipulating his memories and his mind. Despite a lack of sexual education, Denji never goes out of his way to get in people's personal space or harass them. Instead, he's often the one that's placed into uncomfortable and compromising situations where he can't really pass the unequal dynamics at play. I know saying that is gonna get me flamed, but I'm just keeping it real as a fan of the manga. The Bomb Girl arc introduces Reze, whom Denji meets in a phone booth while it's pouring down. Denji does a magic trick for her to cheer her up because her dog allegedly passed away, but most of the things she says are lies. But it's fun to see the two of them having fun together in this arc. Despite her nefarious intentions with Denji, she begins checking off all the boxes for a girl that Denji could fall for. She's kind to him and she lays it on thick like Makima does by being overly affectionate and isn't really afraid to tease him and touch his body. He immediately picks up on signs that she's interested in him straight away. The speed in which Denji realizes that she's flirting with him shows that he's becoming really astute at reading other people's body language and how they're interacting with him. Unfortunately, he doesn't know that she wants to kill him because he's Chainsaw Man. This might be controversial to say, but I believe that Reze's ignorance manifests as self-doubt, because she lectures Denji about how it's wrong that he works in public service and risks his life, and that normal kids would be going to school and having hobbies and friends their age. She asserts that his quality of life is at the bare minimum of standard of living in Japan, so the cost of working the job that he does isn't really outweighed by the benefits like he thinks. This is ironic because even though she's trying to manipulate him, everything she's saying applies doubly to her. She was raised to be an assassin and never once had a normal childhood, and she's almost projecting her fears and doubts onto him because while they're true, she knows the weight that they carry because of how she feels about them. She chooses to ignore it despite knowing how she feels because it would make her a less effective assassin. But once again, Denji is overwhelmed because someone is directly challenging his simplistic worldviews. If he accepts what she's saying, then Makima is a bad person for endangering his life all the time. But that can't be true, because that would destroy his internal conception of who Makima is as a person and why he's attracted to her. Reze offers to run away with Denji because she claims she likes him, but Denji counters with his appreciation of how stable his life has become. He reciprocates her feelings, but ultimately he wants to preserve his way of living for now. In response, Reze bites off his tongue because he likely has feelings for somebody else and he doesn't want to run away with her. Then she reaffirms her commitment to the mission to seize the Chainsaw Devil by ripping out his heart. An elongated battle with public safety ensues with members dying and a whole lot more. At the end of the battle, he uses his chains to drag her in the water and they both wash up on shore. Denji tells her that he's living a wonderful life, and even though it's at the bare minimum, he feels motivated to go each day and he's seemingly content with that. He doesn't want her to die, so he's not going to arrest her. And she clarifies that she never felt anything for him. Everything she said was a product of her training. In response, Denji offers to run away with her, and he's not one for symbolic gestures, so I think he was serious. He believes that together they can fend off the people that come after them, and he still likes her even though she claimed not to like him. And he points out that she did teach him how to swim, indicating that he believes that their bond is genuine. If Reze truly wanted Denji dead per the terms of the mission, she probably could have ripped his heart out when they met. In a phone booth, she could have grabbed his heart, then blew up the rest of his body, making it really easy to retrieve the Chainsaw Devil. Denji says that he'll wait for her at the cafe at noon, and prior to her train departing, Reze actually decides to turn back for him. Upon returning to the cafe to meet with Denji to run away with him, she's incapacitated by Makima, who tracked her using the hearing she borrowed from animals. Denji is none the wiser, and he thinks she simply brushed him off and skipped town. Despite never being able to tell Denji how she felt about her life, she wanted to overcome her self-doubts by living out the childhood she never had with Denji. She stood to gain pretty much nothing by going back to the cafe and indulging the idea of actually running away with him. Would they be good for each other? Probably not. But if nothing else, I think she genuinely wanted her life to change, and maybe being friends with Denji was a good start to that. Denji, on the other hand, is worse off because he's been abandoned emotionally, and Makima re-establishes her dominion over him as the one woman he'd do anything for, completely quelling any doubts he had about whether his life was worth living or not. After all, Makima doesn't benefit from Denji thinking that his life could be better. If nothing else, Denji gained a greater awareness of romantic and social cues because he applied them with a new friend. And I'm kind of sad that we didn't get to see them develop, because while I don't think they would have complemented each other in terms of their romance, I think that their ability to fill in the gaps and give each other a childhood would have been really interesting to see. During the International Assassins arc, Quanxi is informed by Kishibe that Makima is listening to their conversation. He asks her in writing if she'll cooperate with his plan to kill her. Quanxi explains that she used to watch a reporter on the news and she really liked her, but as she learned more and more scandalous things, it destroyed her internal conception of that person, which led her to stop watching the program because she was happier when she didn't know anything about the reporter. This is where she replies to Kishibe's offer. The secret to leading a happy life in this world is that ignorance is bliss, which is an outright rejection of his plan, alluding to her own priorities on this mission being more important to her than helping a friend. While aiding Denji in the fight against Santa Claus, Quanxi tells Denji not to think of the dolls as actual people, because it makes them more difficult to kill if he tries to understand the human dolls are. Quanxi has been killing far longer than Denji, and she explicitly tells him to be ignorant of his enemy's circumstance or he'll be killed in the line of duty. This is because Denji values lives whether they're humans or devils. The humans being controlled by Santa Claus aren't in control of their bodies, they're conscious but they can't control their limbs, which makes it difficult for Denji to attack them because of his empathy for their situation. When Makima captures Quanxi in her harem, she listens to Quanxi plead for the lives of her fiends, before quoting Pingxi saying, "A corpse is talking," and killing the harem and taking control of Quanxi. You may feel compelled to say that she should have just cooperated with Kishibe, but she cared about giving her girlfriends human rights and getting them an education, so her priorities conflicted with her obligations to her old friend. Her ignorance led her to the decision that she wanted most, and unfortunately, it just didn't play out in her favor, and she ended up losing them all. Quanxi uses voluntary ignorance to continue living because it's necessary to live without thinking too deeply, or you may come to realize the ugliness of your decision, as well as its consequences. Kishibe's ignorance is the most compelling in the manga to me. He quizzes Denji and Power about how they feel about teammates dying, what their thoughts are on revenge, and which side they'd prefer to side with. Their answers dictate that he prefers devil hunters who have high self-preservation instincts as a priority. He wants people that will get it done. However, Denji and Power answer differently for the third question because the side that's winning isn't necessarily the side that will take care of you. You might be used as a weapon of war, but disposed of after the war is over, for example, so they're not logically the same thing. When Quanxi is slaughtered in front of Kishibe, he chooses not to look. The blindfolds exist for two reasons. Firstly, no one's allowed to know the contracts that Makima has, and secondly, he can't bear to see his only friend slaughtered. You may have heard or seen from the Volume 8 extra pages or the light novel that Kishibe is in love with Quanxi despite her being a lesbian. His ignorance isn't that she'll never love him back and he doesn't know that, it's that he fixates on her as a constant in his life. When she confesses to him that she thinks she likes women after he tries to get with her for 9 years, he simply replies that he knew that already. In the light novel, he goes on a bit of a monologue about why she's easy to love, but even after it, you don't walk away from that feeling like he has unrequited feelings for someone who's not into men. It's more in line with his unwillingness to accept how many people die in public safety, and it's simply easier to fixate on the one constant who will not die to cope with how much the world changes around you, as well as how harrowing that feeling can be. Even the badass Kishibe has a heart that steers his mind away from the truth. There are two things that will never change. Firstly, the taste of alcohol, and the second, that Quanxi is alive. He doesn't feign ignorance to purposely make her uncomfortable by constantly asking her out, but because it would bring him back to the reality where everyone dies around him. Only the two of them will be left standing at the end of the day in their line of work. This leads into the scene where he says, "I don't want to see a thing." Our battle-hardened Kishibe looks away from Makima's slaughter, since he still has a heart that cares for his only living friend. Ignorance pervades everyone's lives in Chainsaw Man, because without the ability to choose what we can turn away from, going forward and facing adversity might be too difficult for us. But having the choice to either face it or run away from it is a symbol of what it means to be free. Denji is a pretty ignorant kid, but he doesn't understand much about the world yet. He's only 16 years old and unable to come to terms with the deep trauma in the back of his mind. It's not that surprising that he continually turns away from asking himself too many questions. His pattern of avoidance with self-reflection is because laying bare his vulnerabilities would expose him to more and more questions about himself, who he is, and why he acts the way he does, and ultimately, push him closer to the one thing that could destroy him, the truth of what's behind that door. Denji can't face what's behind that door, because it would completely ruin his image of a normal life. The entire ending act of part 1 is the execution of Makima's long-term plan to mentally destroy Denji, so that he no longer believes he can lead a normal life. She begins by turning Aki Hayakawa into the gun fiend, forcing Denji to kill him. Denji is so broken by the trauma of Aki's passing that it drove him straight to Makima's door, pledging that he no longer wants to think for himself anymore, because he cannot bear the pain of consciously facing reality due to his grief. This would in turn bring Power to Makima's door so that she can kill her in front of Denji. Even though she told Denji what would happen with Aki, and now she's telling him to his face what will happen with Power, Denji still wants to live in his ignorant fantasy where he doesn't have to live and think about difficult things. So he's just perplexed and unable to process things as a matter of fact. Power is split in two right in front of Denji while holding a birthday cake for his 17th birthday. Her entire plan was to nullify the contract with the Chainsaw Devil by creating a breach in it. Pochita wanted Denji to live a normal life and witness his dreams, but with the revelation of the truth behind the door, Denji doesn't feel normal anymore. He's no longer a simple guy who can eat 3 meals a day and has a roof over his head. He's a 16-year-old boy who killed his father in self-defense, who is undeserving of any stability. And he's hearing this from the last living person he is attached to. This voids the contract, effectively ending Denji's time as the Chainsaw Man, and resurrecting Pochita, the original Chainsaw Devil. Makima wants to control Chainsaw Man because it will afford her his ability to consume devils, completely erasing their concepts from history and existence. She talks about how human tragedies such as the inception of nuclear weapons, the Nazis, and AIDS have all been erased from the memories of mankind, since the devils were eaten by Chainsaw Man. Makima is likely one of the few people that can remember their names anymore. She names 3 examples of things she wants to eliminate: death, war, and hunger. They probably sound familiar because her name is the Control Devil, or conquest, which verifies the existence of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse which she is a part of. Makima's game plan is to create a utopian society that's free of fear and hardship, and if she fails to do so, she wishes to be eaten by Chainsaw Man, because she'd feel honored to be erased from history as a fan of his. There are some theories as to why Makima says this, but I think that she's just happy to be part of the chaotic cycle of erasure that Chainsaw Man enables. Devils are as strong as they are feared, and so long as fear is rampant in the world, powerful devils will exist. So it's Chainsaw Man's role to erase those names for Makima's new world without fear. Makima can control large groups of people as evidenced by her contract with the Prime Minister, but Chainsaw Man can erase entire concepts of fear from existence. This allows her to pacify all of mankind through ignorance of fear. Would that new world even be good? Picture a world where you never feel stress, sadness, grief, or any complicated human emotion. Yeah, you might be smiling and enjoying yourself most of the time that you're alive, but you'll also never experience the catharsis that comes with overcoming a roadblock through your own ethic and motivation. You will never feel the relief of asking that person you're enamored with on a date and learning how much you have in common. You will never find joy in developing a skill that you initially struggled with. You won't get to mourn the passing of someone you really care about, and everyday life is just an artificial simulation of freedom with all the downsides removed. Life may be filled with hardship, but it's mankind's choice which parts we get to turn away from. Removing the ability to feel anything difficult is not freedom, it's the picture of complete ignorance that is born out of fear. This is the definition of irony. Makima's dream is to stand on equal footing with others and form meaningful relationships with them. But in her new world, her own dream becomes impossible. There is no way for people to reject Makima or even turn away from her in fear. Their default setting is to just accept everything that happens. They cannot realistically choose to befriend her under her own rule set because she can't be rejected. With any positive outcome, there's a chance for failure because they're two parts of the same coin. In her utopia, when you ask that person out, they're not saying yes because they're interested in you. They're saying yes because rejection doesn't exist anymore. And it's exactly this line of thinking that shows how Makima's perception of others has become so skewed by her isolation. It's not that all outcomes are good in Makima's new world, it's that all outcomes are the same because nothing bad can happen. Without free will to say no, to reject someone, and to have a clear idea of what you want, you're free to be how Makima wants you to be, not really free to choose for yourself and have preferences and individuality. When people can't be afraid of her anymore, surely that makes them equals, right? Concerning ignorance, Kobeni has the most realistic perception of it of the entire cast. There's no such thing as a life free of bad things, except in your dreams. This is why every single character embraces ignorance so proudly, because they need it to move forward. And sometimes that means they'll choose when they have to face the truth, and others when they have to tell themselves a fiction to move forward. If we had to think about every awful thing happening in the world on every day, we might find it difficult to go forward. But because we can filter out what we think about every day, it's easy to manage our daily lives. But you're not going to get off of your 9 to 5 shift and then start bombarding yourself with things that are just going to hurt you mentally. There's no sense in doing that. When Denji is brought back to life, he reflects on how selfishly he views life, and he even says that popularity is why he wants to be Chainsaw Man. He's not lying to the audience, that's just who he is right now. He hasn't really had the time to process his grief properly, and he still has time to grow. He realizes that he's just been a dog that's part of someone else's ambition, not truly free to live how he wants. Despite everything she did to him, he still likes Makima, until she says that she wants to rid the world of bad movies. This gives Denji the resolve to kill her. It's funny at a glance, but it shows that Denji understands that she's just building a world according to her preferences, not because there's actual meaning or virtue in her goal. Her new world has no merits. It's a world made in her image, not a real and sustainable utopia. In my eyes, the height of Makima's ignorance manifests when she talks about what Chainsaw Man represents. She believes that Denji's unbefitting of what Chainsaw Man stands for and waxes on about how he's chaotic and it's strange that Denji was chosen by him. She believes that he's unpredictable, he stands alone, and he's the enemy of all devils, and she feels that she gets him. She doesn't understand the first thing about Pochita. She thinks that he doesn't talk, doesn't wear clothes, and that he should be chaotic, but Pochita just wants a damn hug, and he can't because he's constantly in conflict because of his strength and his powers, so all the other devils are out to kill him. He is just as lonely as her, and it's because he's trapped in an ironic and sad cycle of violence. But Pochita loved and cared about Denji, something that she can't fathom about his motivations. She couldn't really understand the bond between a boy and his chainsaw. The most ironic thing that Makima did was get involved in a field where everyone hates devils, No one at public safety is going to be like, yeah, I'd befriend a devil. Even Aki feels that way. She only knew how to create relationships through fear, and she just needed something like family. She saw how happy Denji could be with his family, and she never once thought, maybe I should change myself so that I can enjoy this kind of thing. No, instead she wants to make a utopia where everyone has to change for her. The question of whether Makima's plan will work or not is irrelevant. The plan involves subjecting all of existence to what one person has deemed appropriate for them. Makima may indeed be powerful, but she's not infallible. She wants to get rid of bad movies, which is not even objectively right or wrong, it's just a preference. But doing so would flatten everyone's ability to develop their own taste in movies. It's very ironic that the Devil of Conquest would feel lonely and want to have friends and family, but as Denji noted in the beginning of the story, if there was a devil he could befriend, he probably would. You can say that Denji's ignorant, yes, motivated by stupid things like sex, relationships, and other juvenile things, but is it really that selfish when you're going through puberty and it's normal to be curious about that stuff at that age? The problem with Makima is that she sees everything in terms of absolutes. Everything is black and white to her. Denji is nothing but the murder he committed, and she is nothing but what she is now, so she can never connect to anyone. By contrast, Denji is willing to accept that things are flawed and imperfect, even Makima, who he admits he still likes even after everything she did. She's inflexible and unwilling to compromise, but Denji is constantly dealt a shit hand and he still makes the best of it. That's what makes him such a kind and compassionate person, because he understands that everyone's going through something and he never expresses like a deep outward hatred for many people in the story. I don't buy the argument that because his motivations are shallow that he's a bad person. His dreams be damned, there's nothing wrong about them that guides him to some horrible behavior or anything like that. In Makima's ignorance, she stopped believing that she could change and tried to force the world to change in her favor. She speaks with an element of righteousness, but she didn't understand the first thing about Pochita or the Chainsaw Devil and what they stood for. She just saw what she wanted to see, because it's easier to believe something like that if it makes her feel less alone. Pochita is not your tool to make a new world. He's just trapped in unending combat when all he wants is a hug. Maybe if Makima knew the truth of his dream, she would have found the strength to face her own fears and actually try and connect with others, to form meaningful relationships and stop ruling through fear. Maybe everyone would still be alive and they could all go out and enjoy food and drinks together again. But everyone, especially Denji, has to move forward from here, to face life head on despite the pain you feel inside. That is one of the most painful things about overcoming grief. And based on how he's going in part 2, I think that he's doing just fine. In Chainsaw Man, just about everyone was destroyed by their ignorance. Even if it served them well during the time that they were alive. Denji was free to live how he pleased when he made that contract with Pochita in the trash can, and he was given a second lease on life when power resurrected him in a trash can again. It's funny, Denji always begins his journey of emancipation in a trash can. Nobody gets the right to say that you don't have a right to live because how you live doesn't fit within their ideal. Denji is constantly challenged on the way he lives, and he doesn't really do anything egregiously wrong with his life. Wanting to be appreciated and exploring your sexuality is pretty normal in my eyes. Where Makima believed that Denji was undeserving of his power and unfit to live a normal life, his ignorance never hurt anybody. If you turn on the TV today, you might hear that older generations had it harder, or that we aren't making more of ourselves. But only you can determine what your life means, because at the end of the day, you're the one living it. If Denji wants to have a full belly and be popular with girls, let him. Not once have those motivations shown that he is unkind and unempathetic. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Because he's so simple, it's really easy for him to be nice to others. Denji is a good kid. Denji doesn't magically become a morally upstanding and righteous individual at the end of part 1. He's still interested in things like being popular with girls and being worshipped as Chainsaw Man, so it's not like he's the picture of a hero. But that's why he's a great protagonist. He doesn't just change and become something that feels unearned. You gradually watch him grow through the process of becoming more understanding and more empathetic, and the change is granular, but it's realistic. The rigidity of who we are is only as firm as we want it to be. The things we experience all contribute to our growth and change, and in Chainsaw Man Part 2, we're already seeing Denji grow in some ways and fail in others. He's not magically going to become an idealized version of himself. He hasn't even lived a quarter of his life yet. We do get to see how much he's matured emotionally though, and the steps he's taken to be a good older brother like Aki was before him. And if I gotta say it one more time, our boy is a well-written protagonist, and that doesn't mean he'll be palatable for you, but he's not beloved because he loves thinking about sex. It's because he's kind and compassionate and constantly proves the critics wrong through the narrative. I hope you enjoyed my essay on Chainsaw Man and ignorance, because it definitely made me think hard about the things I take for granted in my day-to-day life so that things are easier for me. If I had to think about everything wrong in the world every single day at every single hour, I probably would be too debilitated to get through the 9 to 5, but thankfully I know how to filter that out. Thank you for your time. I've been Meatman, and it's been a pleasure borrowing your time today, a lot of it in fact. Catch you in the next essay or the next patch notes. Peace.